Yeah.
Iran is not about to surrender. It's not going to crumble. There will be no uprising to remove the regime. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready. This is going to go on and on and on until Israel is practically destroyed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty serious, a warning from Colonel Macgregor. He basically says, truth is in short supply when you're talking about war.
Yeah, it's a stark opening.
It really is. And we're going to dive into that specifically regarding the U.S. stance towards Iran right now. The sources we're looking at, they make this really powerful case that the U.S. is, well, being pulled into a conflict, a potentially disastrous one.
And that's our mission today, really, to unpack those arguments, not just if it's happening, but, why our sources seem to think it's almost inevitable.
Right.
And crucially, what does this actually mean for you listening, for American citizens, for the whole global economy? It's about trying to get a clear picture.
And let's just get straight to it, because the core point in these sources, it's pretty shocking. They argue the U.S. is already a co-belligerent, basically a partner in the fight Israel started with Iran.
Right, they draw parallels to the situation in Ukraine.
Exactly. And Macgregor's prediction is blunt. U.S. military action against Iran. It's not a question of if, but when.
Yeah.
That's quite a claim to start with.
It definitely sets the stage. And it frames this whole thing not as some new crisis, but as almost a pattern, a replay.
A replay? How so?
Well, the sources really push back against the idea that this is about U.S. national security, in the traditional sense. They call it another replay of the same failed strategy.
Regime change.
That's the implication. Regime change operations.
Yeah.
They're asking us to look past the official reasons, the public statements, and consider what they see as the real drivers, the forces underneath.
Okay, so if it's not purely national security driving this, according to these sources, what is driving it? Macgregor seems to point to three specific forces. He claims they're unified, and his words, 100% in Israel's pocket. What's the first one?
The first one he identifies is the mainstream media.
Okay.
He doesn't pull punches there. Describes them as completely on board with a pro-war view, essentially acting as part of the war propaganda machine.
Citing that old saying, truth is the first casualty.
Exactly. The idea is that the media shapes the narrative, gets the public ready to accept military action. That's the first pillar he points to.
And this alleged alignment doesn't stop at the media, right? The sources claim it goes right to the top in Washington.
That's right. Macgregor contends that both Congress and the White House are, again in his view, heavily influenced by these same interests. Again, 100% in Israel's pocket.
Strong language.
Very. And he links it directly to money, to who provides the funding. He mentions real masters, people that provided money to seize the White House.
He names names.
He does. He specifically mentions billionaires like the Adelsons and what he calls Jewish billionaires that fund the lobby, which is clearly pointing towards groups like AIPAC.
The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, known for its influence.
Precisely. So the argument is that policy isn't necessarily driven by pure national interest, but by these powerful financial and lobbying pressures.
Okay, so media influence, political influence. What's the third leg of this stool, as the sources describe it?
The military-industrial sector, or complex, you might say.
Right. The defense contractors, the military leadership.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Described as being led by the retired and active four-stars and their shareholders. And again, the claim from the source is also 100% in Israel's pocket.
And the motive here?
According to this analysis, it's incredibly stark. Everything is about money.
Everyone is greedy.
Yes. And this whole system, this complex, it thrives off bloodshed, especially prolonged bloodshed. The picture painted is one where conflict isn't a policy failure. It's actually profitable. It fuels itself.
Wow. That's a deeply cynical view of how foreign policy might work.
It is. But it's central to the source's argument about why this push towards conflict might be happening. It suggests economic drivers might be overriding strategic ones.
So you have these three incredibly powerful forces allegedly working together. Does this kind of thing, this type of influence, have historical parallels? The sources seem to suggest this isn't new.
Absolutely. That's what's interesting. They frame it as part of a recurring pattern in U.S. foreign policy.
Even mentioning someone like Trump, despite the America First talk.
Yeah, they depict him as listening to the very same poisonous voices, as they put it, that took us into Ukraine. So the argument isn't about strategy or careful diplomacy. It's described more as a bullying approach, kind of like a business tactic applied to global affairs, which they argue is a serious mistake. It suggests these powerful interests persist across administrations.
Okay, so if these forces are, as the sources claim, pushing towards war, why do they consider that path so disastrous? I mean, surely there's a counter-argument that Iran is a threat.
Well, the sources argue there's a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate underestimation of Iran.
How so?
The common narrative, that Iran is weak and already in a state of disarray, they say the opposite is the case. They argue Iran is much more capable than often portrayed.
Capable in what way? Militarily?
Yes, specifically militarily. The sources emphasize Iran's tremendous missile and air power.
Right.
They even suggest that recent events showed Israel realizing, we didn't appreciate the power of the Iranian missile arsenal.
And there was mention of the Iron Dome, Israel's defense system.
Yeah, the sources claim the Iron Dome has turned out to be a sieve, meaning it might not be nearly as effective against a large-scale, sophisticated attack as people thought. This reassessment is key to why they see a war as potentially so foolish.
Which, if true, raises serious questions about U.S. vulnerabilities, doesn't it? If our own defenses are, as the sources put it, woefully behind.
Exactly. They use that pretty dismissive phrase, red-headed stepchildren, suggesting these defenses haven't been prioritized.
So if Iran has this missile power and our defenses are maybe not up to scratch, what about U.S. personnel in the region?
That's a huge concern highlighted in the sources. They talk about the over 40,000 troops on the ground in the region.
40,000, wow.
And if the U.S. were to attack Iran directly, the fear is these troops could become sitting ducks. The sources warn bluntly it could lead to a lot of people being lost, a very high human cost, potentially.
Okay, so direct military costs are huge. What about the wider impact economically?
That's another major warning. Potentially catastrophic is how it's framed.
Because Iran could.
Because Iran has the capability, they argue, to shut down a lot of the supply and production and movement of the global natural gas and oil supply.
Through choke points like
the Suez Canal and critically the Strait of Hormuz. A massive chunk of the world's oil goes through Hormuz every day.
Right. It's vital.
And the sources mention Iran has explicitly threatened to block passage there if they feel threatened.
And what does that mean for you listening at home? How does that translate?
It translates directly into your cost of living. The sources say expect inflation, rising prices, maybe even another energy crisis again. It's not abstract. It hits your wallet, your daily life.
Okay, that's grim. Is there anything worse?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
There's what the sources call the nuclear wildcard.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. They raise the possibility of nuclear escalation, specifically mentioning Pakistan.
Pakistan, how do they fit in?
The sources warn that if, hypothetically, Israel were to use a nuclear weapon against Iran, Pakistan might feel compelled to supply nuclear weapons to Iran in response. Kind of regional nuclear domino effect.
That's terrifying.
It's described as opening a Pandora's box that no one in their right mind should want to open. The risks become almost unimaginable at that point.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Let's talk about the story being told, the narrative driving this potential conflict. Because the sources spend a lot of time deconstructing what they call the lie behind it all.
Right. This constant refrain we hear, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
But the sources point to contradictions. They cite things like Tulsi Gabbard's testimony to Congress, a CNN report saying the U.S. has no evidence that Iran is creating a nuclear weapon, and that even if they tried, it would be years away.
And Iran's own statements.
They mention Iran's supreme leader apparently saying during talks that they weren't posing any kind of military threat. So there's this disconnect between the constant public warnings and what intelligence or diplomatic channels might be saying.
Why the disconnect then, according to these sources? What's the purpose of that narrative?
Well, the suggestion is it's about maintaining a justification for potential conflict. They point to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
The Obama-era deal.
That's the one. The sources argue that deal, which aimed to limit Iran's nuclear program through diplomacy, was deliberately undermined.
Why?
To prevent removing the pretext for war. If diplomacy solved the nuclear issue, you lose a major reason or excuse for confrontation. That's the argument presented.
And this fits into that bigger pattern you mentioned earlier, the replay of failed strategy.
Exactly. The sources explicitly say this is another replay. They list the examples: Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. all presented as senseless wars that the U.S. stays and occupies.
Leading to potentially an Iraq 2.0, but maybe worse this time.
Potentially much worse, they argue, because Iran today is seen as far more capable and influential than Iraq was then. The fear is we're repeating mistakes without learning.
Is there one example they focus on as a particular warning?
Yes, Libya comes up frequently.
Gaddafi giving up his WMDs.
Precisely. The argument is Gaddafi abandoned his nuclear weapons program back in 2003, trusting in agreements. Then in 2011, he was overthrown, brutally, with NATO support.
And the result in Libya.
According to the sources, chaos, open slave trade markets, complete despair.
So the lesson for Iran is?
The sources suggest this gives Iran every incentive not to trust agreements and potentially to pursue nuclear weapons as the ultimate security guarantee. Giving them up didn't save Gaddafi. Why would it save them? It feeds into this idea of U.S. diplomacy being perceived as dishonest or twisted.
And what about the idea that Iranians themselves might welcome an attack as a chance to overthrow their own government? We hear that sometimes.
The sources call that one big lie.
Really? Why?
They argue Iran is actually far more cohesive socially than the United States, and that facing an external attack wouldn't cause revolution. It would likely unify people against the attacker, an existential crisis for the nation, not liberation. It suggests a fundamental misreading of Iranian society by war proponents.
Okay, so the sources paint a picture of a potentially disastrous war based on flawed premises. Let's bring it home. What do they say are the true costs for Americans beyond the battlefield?
Well, they link foreign policy directly to domestic issues. First, the sheer cost. These wars are a huge source of so much debt for the country.
Okay, the financial burden. What else?
Civil liberties. The sources argue there's a direct connection between foreign wars and the curtailment of civil liberties at home.
Examples.
They point to things like the Patriot Act, the creation of DHS and the TSA, the whole expansion of the surveillance state that really took off after 9/11 and the wars that followed. The argument is, war abroad often means less freedom at home.
But do most Americans really connect those dots? The sources acknowledge people often disregard foreign policy, right?
They do. They say the typical American does largely disregard foreign policy for the most part, but they stress it's deeply intertwined with our daily lives.
And people will notice when.
You'll notice, when the gas costs $7 a gallon, when the supply chains break down, when you can't get something to eat, that's when the apathy disappears, they argue, because the impact becomes unavoidable. Painfully real.
Is there also a critique about the planning behind this? Or lack thereof?
Yes, a significant one. The U.S. is portrayed as just running into this war without really asking the basic questions. What's the point? What do we achieve?
No clear strategic goal.
Apparently not, according to these analyses. They contrast it with someone like Ronald Reagan, who, despite criticism, made the rational decision to pull troops out of Lebanon when it became clear there was no achievable mission for them there. That kind of strategic thinking, they argue, is missing now.
And what does this approach, this twisted diplomacy, as they call it, do to America's standing in the world?
It tanks it, basically. It destroys trust. The sources say it ruins the prospect of any other party around the world trusting the United States and its diplomacy.
Which complicates everything else.
Everything. Think about relations with major powers. Iran is a BRICS country now, allied with Russia. This push towards conflict makes cooperation on other issues, maybe even peace efforts in places like Ukraine, much harder. It just creates more instability and mistrust globally.
And finally, they mention internal risks, security risks here at home.
Yes, and this is quite chilling. They link it to border security issues, the presence of millions of unidentified individuals. The source uses the phrase corruption, criminality, and terrorism. All of those things blend nicely.
And they give specific scenarios, not predictions, but warnings.
Warnings, yes. Things like, what if a mall in Seattle was blown up? Or worse, what if someone placed a low-yield nuclear weapon in proximity to Washington? These aren't predictions, let's be clear. But they're presented as the kind of horrifying domestic consequence that could stem from reckless foreign adventures in porous borders.
So, wrapping this all up, this deep dive into the source material, it really sketches out a path towards war-driven, allegedly, by specific interests, media, political, military, industrial, rather than clear national security needs.
That's the core argument. And the potential consequences, as laid out in these sources, are painted as genuinely catastrophic, both for U.S. troops and interests abroad, and for every single American right here at home, through economic pain and maybe even direct security threats.
It leaves you with some really tough questions, doesn't it? If Colonel Macgregor's assessment is anywhere near accurate, that everyone in Washington is rotten to the core on this, that truth doesn't matter when the war machine narrative prevails, what could possibly change things?
Right. If, as they suggest, no one's listening until people are truly hurting, what does that hurting even look like? And maybe the biggest question, what would it actually take for the U.S. and its allies to, as the sources put it, behave like a normal state in the region?
And what would that mean for the global power structures, the financial hegemony the sources talk about?
Exactly. Heavy questions. A lot to think about long after this deep dive ends.